Don't waste time talking to him. He's just the gardener." The cashier's smile disappeared. A couple standing behind me chuckled. My own son-in-law pointed at me as if I were a stranger who had wandered into the wrong place. Then he looked me straight in the eye and said, "People like him should know their place." What hurt wasn't the laughter. What hurt was seeing my daughter standing beside him and saying absolutely nothing. I stood there holding a gallon of milk and a loaf of wheat bread, feeling smaller than I had felt in years. The worst part? The man humiliating me in front of half the store had no idea who had spent decades building the life he enjoyed. Before I tell you what happened next, if this story truly resonates with you, please consider liking the video and subscribing, but only if this story speaks to your heart. And I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Tell me your city, your country, and your local time in the comments below. My name is William Harrison. I'm 74 years old, and this is the story of the day my family stopped seeing me as a father and started seeing me as an obstacle. It was also the day everything began to change. And whatever lesson you take away from this story, stay with me until the end. Now let me tell you where it all began. It happened on a chilly Saturday afternoon in Denver, Colorado. The parking lot outside the Walmart Supercenter was packed, and the mountains in the distance were covered with fresh snow. I had spent the morning visiting a longtime friend recovering from surgery and stopped to pick up groceries on my way home. I wore old jeans, a faded navy jacket, and work boots that had seen better days. I looked exactly the way I liked to look, comfortable. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I pushed my cart into the checkout line and waited my turn. The young cashier smiled and said, "How's your day going, sir?" Before I could answer, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Well, look who it is." My stomach tightened. I turned around and saw Brandon Reed, my son-in-law, standing there with my daughter Emily. Brandon wore an expensive charcoal suit and a watch that probably cost more than my first truck. "Hello, Brandon," I said calmly. Emily forced a smile. "Hi, Dad." The cashier looked between us. "Oh, you know each other?" Brandon laughed. "Not exactly." Then came the words that seemed to freeze the air around me. "Don't talk to him. He's just the gardener." Several people nearby laughed. The cashier looked confused. "Oh, I'm sorry." Brandon grinned as if he'd just told the funniest joke in the world. "Trust me, he's nobody important." Emily stared at the floor. She didn't defend me. She didn't correct him. She didn't even look at me. For a moment, I wanted to leave my cart and walk out. But something inside me refused to give him that satisfaction. So I simply paid for my groceries. As the cashier handed me the receipt, she quietly whispered, "Have a good day, sir." I smiled and thanked her. Brandon shook his head. "You always did know how to play the victim." I looked at him and said, "Take care of yourself, Brandon." That seemed to irritate him even more. As I walked toward the exit, I could hear him laughing with a few people nearby. The automatic doors opened, and cold air rushed across my face. I loaded my groceries into my pickup truck and sat there for several minutes without starting the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel. My chest felt heavy. Not because of Brandon. Not entirely. It was because of Emily. I kept seeing her standing there in silence. When my wife passed away 5 years earlier, I promised myself I would do everything possible to keep our family together. I had spent birthdays alone so my children could have better opportunities. I had missed vacations, worked weekends, and sacrificed more than anyone would ever know. Yet somehow I had become invisible. My phone rang just as I pulled out of the parking lot. The caller ID made me frown. It was Thomas Whitaker, chairman of our board of directors. Thomas never called on weekends unless something was wrong. "William," he said the moment I answered. His voice sounded tense. "Where are you?" "Just leaving Walmart." There was a pause. "We need to talk. Today. Can it wait until Monday?" "No." Another pause followed. Then he lowered his voice. "There's something you need to see before anyone else does." My grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What are you talking about?" Thomas exhaled slowly. "I think someone close to you has been planning something for a very long time." Before I could ask another question, he added 6 words that made my blood run cold. "And I think it's already started." After I ended the call with Thomas Whitaker, I sat in my truck for several minutes staring through the windshield. Snow flurries drifted across the parking lot, and memories I had not visited in years began rising to the surface. Whenever life hurts deeply enough, the mind has a strange way of walking back to where everything started. For me, that place was a small 2-bedroom house on the edge of Denver more than 40 years ago. Back then, I was a young husband with a used pickup truck, a lawn mower that barely started, and a dream that seemed far too big for a man with only $300 in his checking account. My wife, Margaret, believed in that dream long before anyone else did. I still remember sitting at our kitchen table one night while Emily was 6 years old and coloring pictures beside us. Margaret squeezed my hand and said, "William, one day people will see what you are building." I laughed and shook my head. Right now I would settle for paying next month's electric bill. She smiled. "You always look at what is missing." "I look at what is possible." Emily looked up from her crayons and asked, "Daddy, when we are rich, can we get a dog?" Margaret and I both laughed. "When we are rich," I told her, "we can get 2 dogs." Those were difficult years, but they were beautiful years too. I worked 14-hour days. I mowed lawns, planted trees, repaired irrigation systems, and shoveled snow during winter storms. Many nights I came home exhausted, but Emily would run to the front door yelling, "Daddy's home," and suddenly the fatigue would disappear. As the company slowly grew, I promised myself one thing. My family would never feel the struggles I had felt growing up. That promise became the center of my life. Maybe that was my first mistake. When Emily became a teenager, she wanted the best schools. She got them. When she wanted a reliable car for college, she got that too. Margaret occasionally worried that I was giving too much. "William," she would say gently, "children need support, but they also need perspective." I always answered the same way. I never had these opportunities. I want her to have every chance. Years later, Emily met Brandon. At first, I liked him. He was confident, ambitious, and polite. The first time he visited our house, he complimented Margaret's cooking and offered to help wash dishes afterward. After he left, Emily smiled and asked, "So what do you think?" I told her honestly, "I think he makes you happy." The day they married, I stood beside Margaret in the church and felt proud. I believed our family was growing stronger. What I did not notice were the small things, the little moments that seemed harmless at the time. One Thanksgiving dinner, Brandon joked about one of our maintenance workers. "Some people are born to lead," he said while carving turkey. "Others are born to take orders." The room became quiet. Margaret frowned. "Every job deserves respect," she replied. Brandon laughed and changed the subject. Another time, he interrupted a receptionist at our company and later called her replaceable. When I spoke to him privately, he smiled and said, "You worry too much, William. That is just business." Looking back now, I realized those moments were warnings. Margaret saw them too. A few months before she passed away, we were sitting on our back porch watching the sunset. She looked toward the trees and said something I never forgot. "Promise me something." "Anything," I said. "Do not confuse loyalty with love." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She looked at me carefully. "Sometimes people stay close because they value what you provide, not who you are." At the time, I thought she was simply reflecting on life. I did not understand she was trying to prepare me for something. As I finally pulled my truck onto the highway that afternoon, her words echoed through my mind louder than ever before. And for the first time, I began to wonder if the person Thomas was warning me about had been standing right in front of me for years while I was too blinded by family to see the truth. Margaret's words stayed with me the entire drive home. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was beginning to set behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. For years, whenever something bothered me, I had a habit of explaining it away. I made excuses for people I loved. I convinced myself that family deserved endless second chances. But that evening felt different. For the first time in a very long time, I was not looking for excuses. I was looking for answers. I carried my groceries inside, set them on the kitchen counter, and stared at the framed family photo hanging on the wall. It had been taken 10 years earlier during a summer barbecue. Emily was smiling. Brandon had his arm around her shoulder. Margaret stood beside me, laughing at something out of frame. Looking at that picture felt like looking at a different world. My phone rang again. "Thomas Whitaker. Can you meet me tonight?" he asked. "Where?" "The downtown office. 7th floor conference room." I glanced at the clock. "Give me 45 minutes. Denver's skyline glowed against the evening sky as I drove toward headquarters. Harrison Property Services occupied the top floors of a modern glass building overlooking the city. Most people assumed I had retired years ago. That was partly true. I no longer handled daily operations. But I still owned the controlling interest in the company. I still sat on the board. And every major decision ultimately required my approval. When I stepped into the conference room, Thomas was not alone. Seated beside him were board members Linda Foster and Michael Brennan. Their expressions were serious. Thomas slid a folder across the table. "William, before you open this, understand something. We have all been struggling with whether to bring this to you." My stomach tightened. "Why?" Linda answered softly. "Because it involves family." I opened the folder. The first page contained internal emails. The second page contained meeting notes. The third page contained recommendations for restructuring executive leadership. My eyes stopped on one sentence. Proposed transition plan following William Harrison's permanent departure from company influence. I read it twice. Then a third time. Michael leaned forward. "Those documents were not supposed to reach us yet." "Who wrote them?" I asked quietly. "Nobody," answered immediately. Thomas finally said, "Brandon." The room became silent. Years ago, that answer would have triggered anger. It would have sent me rushing to defend him or demand explanations. This time, I simply closed the folder. Thomas looked surprised. "You are taking this remarkably well." I nodded slowly. "No, I am just finally paying attention." That was the moment I did something I had never done before. I did not call Emily. I did not call Brandon. I did not try to smooth things over. For decades, I had been the man who fixed problems before they exploded. This time I decided to watch. Linda exchanged a glance with Michael. "There is more," she said. She handed me another document showing employee turnover reports from the previous 3 years. Department after department showed unusually high resignation rates under Brandon's supervision. Several exit interviews included similar comments. Arrogant leadership, disrespectful treatment, culture of fear. One sentence caught my attention. Senior employees feel increasingly pushed aside. I thought about the cashier at Walmart. I thought about the maintenance workers Brandon mocked. I thought about Margaret's warning. Suddenly, dozens of scattered memories began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. As the meeting ended, Thomas walked me to the elevator. "William," he said, "there is something else happening." I pressed the elevator button. "What now?" He hesitated. "Someone has been quietly contacting key shareholders." I looked at him. "For what purpose?" Thomas lowered his voice. "We are not certain yet, but it appears they are preparing for a major change in control." The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside. Just before the doors closed, Thomas said something that followed me all the way home. "And whoever is behind it seems convinced you will never see it coming." As the elevator descended toward the lobby, I stared at my reflection in the mirrored wall. For the first time, I was beginning to suspect that what I had seen so far was only the surface of something much larger, and somewhere behind those carefully hidden plans, someone was already making their next move. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. Denver was still quiet, and a thin layer of frost covered the backyard. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table where Margaret and I had shared thousands of conversations over the years. Normally, that room brought me peace. That morning, it brought questions. I kept thinking about the shareholders Thomas had mentioned. Harrison Property Services was not a small company anymore. We managed commercial properties across multiple states. Any attempt to shift control would require planning, influence, and trust from key people. That meant someone had been working behind the scenes for a long time. Around 9 o'clock, I drove to one of our regional offices. I told nobody I was coming. I wanted to see things with my own eyes. The receptionist, a woman named Carla who had worked with us for nearly 15 years, looked surprised when I walked in. "Mr. Harrison, it is good to see you." Her smile quickly faded. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She hesitated. "Is it true you are stepping away completely?" I felt a chill despite the warm lobby. "Who told you that?" Carla glanced around before lowering her voice. "People have been talking about it for months. They say you are tired. They say you are not really involved anymore." I stood there silently. Months. Not days. Months. Whatever story had been spreading, it had already taken root. As I continued through the building, I noticed something else. Employees who used to stop and chat now seemed uncertain. Respect was still there, but confusion had replaced confidence. In one department, I overheard a conversation that stopped me cold. I heard the transition is already approved. "Really?" Another employee asked. "That is what management says." Management. The word echoed in my head. I spent the afternoon reviewing reports and speaking with longtime staff members. Piece by piece, a pattern emerged. Brandon had been presenting himself as the future of the company for over a year. He had carefully positioned himself as the inevitable successor. What shocked me most was not the ambition. It was the deception. Several people believed I had personally approved these plans. By late afternoon, I sat alone in an unused conference room reviewing another stack of documents. That was when my phone rang. Emily. I answered immediately. Hello, sweetheart. Her voice sounded distant. Dad, I heard you have been meeting with board members. I leaned back in my chair. Who told you that? Brandon mentioned it. Of course he did. And what exactly did Brandon say? There was a pause. He said some people are trying to turn you against him. I closed my eyes. Emily, do you believe that? Another pause. Longer this time. I do not know what to believe anymore. That answer hurt more than I expected. Not because she doubted me. Because someone had worked hard enough to make her doubt me. After the call ended, I sat there staring at the city skyline through the conference room window. For decades, I had believed trust was the strongest foundation a family could have. Now I was watching that foundation crack beneath my feet. The final blow came just before 5 o'clock. Thomas called again. His voice was urgent. William, where are you? Still at the regional office. You need to come downtown immediately. My pulse quickened. What happened? He exhaled heavily. A document surfaced this afternoon. What kind of document? Silence filled the line for several seconds. Then he finally answered. A proposal recommending that the board permanently remove you from all remaining leadership authority. I felt the air leave my lungs. Who submitted it? Deep down, I already knew the answer. Thomas spoke quietly. The recommendation carries Brandon's name. I stared out the window as the last sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. In that moment, the pieces finally locked together. The rumors, the shareholders, the false stories, the careful positioning. This was not ambition anymore. This was a plan. And as I sat there holding the phone, I realized the life I thought I understood was beginning to collapse around me. That evening, I drove home through downtown Denver feeling as though I had aged 10 years in a single day. The city lights blurred through my windshield, and for the first time since Margaret passed away, I felt truly alone. Not physically alone, emotionally alone. There is a difference. Physical solitude can be peaceful. Emotional isolation feels like standing in a crowded room where nobody recognizes your voice. When I arrived home, I sat at my desk and stared at my phone. Every instinct told me to fight back immediately. Another part of me still hoped there had been some misunderstanding. I decided to try the path I had always chosen throughout my life. Communication. I called Emily first. The call went to voicemail. I waited an hour and called again. Voicemail. I left a message. Emily, sweetheart, I think we need to talk. Not as business people. Not as people taking sides. Just as father and daughter. Please call me when you can. The next morning there was no response. I sent a text message. Hours passed. Nothing. Around lunchtime, I received a reply consisting of only one sentence. I think everyone needs some space right now. I read those words 3 times. They sounded polite, but they felt like a closed door. Later that afternoon, I sent Brandon an email. Not an angry email. Not an accusatory email. A simple one. I wrote, Brandon, there are serious concerns being raised. Before assumptions become facts, I would like to hear your perspective directly. Let us sit down and talk. William. His response arrived less than 30 minutes later. It contained only 2 lines. I have nothing to explain. The board will make its own decisions. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The man I had mentored, promoted, defended, and trusted for years was speaking to me like an opponent. During the following week, I made several more attempts. I mailed a handwritten letter to Emily. I reminded her of family vacations, of fishing trips when she was a little girl, of the promise I made to always be available whenever she needed me. I ended the letter with a simple sentence. No matter what happens, I love you. 10 days later, the envelope returned unopened. Someone had written return to sender across the front. I sat at my kitchen table holding that envelope for nearly an hour. The pain was difficult to describe. Business problems can be solved. Financial problems can be solved. Family wounds are different. Around the same time, strange things began happening inside the company. Several long-time employees stopped returning my calls. One regional manager I had known for over 20 years finally answered after days of silence. His voice sounded nervous. William, I do not think I should be involved. Involved in what? I asked. Another pause. People are saying things. What things? He hesitated. That you are no longer making decisions. That the transition is already happening. that certain people want distance from anyone connected to the old leadership. Old leadership. Hearing those words felt surreal, as if I were reading my own obituary while still alive. A few days later, Thomas forwarded me an internal memo. It described a future leadership structure that did not include me. More disturbing was the distribution list. Dozens of managers had already received copies. The narrative was spreading faster than the truth. Every day it became more accepted. Every day more people treated assumptions as facts. I found myself rereading Margaret's final advice over and over in an old journal she had left behind. Do not confuse loyalty with love. Slowly I began understanding what she meant. Some people had not changed overnight. They had simply stopped hiding who they were. One Friday evening, I sat alone on my back porch watching darkness settle across the neighborhood. My phone remained silent. No calls from Emily. No messages from Brandon. No explanations. No apologies. Just silence. The kind of silence that settles into your chest and makes even familiar places feel unfamiliar. And as the porch light flickered above me and cold air filled the yard, I realized something that frightened me more than the rumors, the documents, or the boardroom politics. The people I had spent my entire life protecting no longer seemed interested in hearing my side of the story. The weeks that followed were some of the loneliest of my life. Not because I was physically alone. I had experienced solitude before. I had spent long nights building a company from nothing. I had spent difficult months after Margaret passed away. But this was different. This was the loneliness of feeling erased from the lives of people you loved. Every morning, I woke up hoping to see a message from Emily. Every evening, I went to bed disappointed. Her birthday came and went. I mailed a card. There was no reply. My grandson Tyler turned 16. For years, I had never missed one of his birthdays. This time, I was not invited. A week later, I learned about the celebration through photographs posted online by distant relatives. I sat in my living room looking at those smiling faces and realized nobody had even told me the party was happening. That discovery hurt far more than I expected. One afternoon, I drove past the baseball field where Tyler used to play when he was younger. I remembered sitting in the bleachers with Margaret, cheering every time he hit the ball. That boy has your stubbornness, she used to laugh. Poor kid, I would joke. Those memories felt like treasures from another lifetime. A few days later, I ran into an old friend named Robert at a coffee shop downtown. Robert had known me for nearly 30 years. The moment he saw me, he frowned. "William, you look tired." I smiled weakly. "I suppose I am." He sat across from me. "What is really going on?" For several seconds I considered giving the polite answer. The answer I always gave. Then something unexpected happened. I told him the truth. Not all of it. Just enough. When I finished speaking, Robert stirred his coffee and quietly said, "You know, there is something I learned after my divorce." I looked up. "What is that?" He shrugged. "The people who truly care about you ask questions before believing rumors." His words stayed with me long after we left the coffee shop. That night, I found myself standing in Margaret's old garden behind the house. Most of the flowers had already faded for the season. The air was cool. The neighborhood was quiet. I looked at the bench where she used to sit and read books during summer evenings. For years after her death, I had focused on keeping everyone else happy. I kept giving, kept fixing, kept protecting. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking whether those efforts were healthy. Standing there in the darkness, I experienced something I had not felt in a long time. Clarity. The realization did not arrive dramatically. It arrived gently. I finally understood that constantly chasing the approval of people who refused to listen was not loyalty. It was surrender. The next morning, Thomas called again. "How are you holding up?" he asked. I looked out the kitchen window toward the garden. "Better than I was." He sounded surprised. "Really?" I nodded, even though he could not see me. For the first time in weeks, I think I understand what is happening. There was a pause. "And what is that?" I took a slow breath. I spent too much time trying to convince people to remember who I am. Maybe it is time to stop explaining and start paying attention. Thomas was silent for several moments. Then he said something unexpected. "If that is truly where your mind is now, there is something you should see." My attention sharpened immediately. What kind of something? Evidence. The word hung in the air between us. Evidence of what? Another pause followed. Evidence that some of what you have been told may not be true. My pulse quickened for the first time in weeks. Not from fear. From curiosity. From possibility. As I ended the call and looked once more at Margaret's garden, I realized the season of enduring might finally be ending, and a very different chapter was about to begin. After the days of isolation and unanswered messages, I made a decision. I would no longer wait for validation from those who had abandoned me. The morning sun reflected off the glass of my office building as I walked inside with a renewed sense of purpose. I greeted the receptionist, Carla, with a small smile. "Good morning, Carla." She returned the smile cautiously. I could see the curiosity in her eyes. Over the next few hours, I moved through the building methodically, visiting departments, talking to employees directly, not through emails or memos. "How are things going?" I asked in the facilities office. One young manager looked up startled. "Mr. Harrison, I raised a hand. "I just want to understand what is really happening here from you." Slowly, employees began opening up. They spoke about ongoing challenges, projects that had stalled, and ideas that had never been implemented. I listened without judgment. I made notes. I promised nothing yet gave encouragement. Later, I met with Robert, my old friend, who still consulted for the company. "William, it looks like you are picking up momentum again," he said. "Yes," I replied, "but not because of anyone else. This time it is only about the work itself, about seeing it through properly." Robert nodded. "Sometimes, people underestimate what quiet leadership can achieve." That afternoon, I returned to my personal office and began reviewing financial statements and operational plans myself. Months of neglect due to internal misdirection were evident. I reorganized priorities, contacted vendors directly, and scheduled meetings with regional managers to hear their insights. By evening, I had laid out a detailed plan to stabilize the departments most affected. When I spoke to Emily later that evening, it was not about family grievances. I said simply, "Emily, I will be in the office tomorrow early. If you want to see how the company runs, come by. No pressure, just observation." She hesitated. "Dad, no explanations necessary. Just come if you like." The next morning, I arrived at the office at 6:30, coffee in hand. Several employees were already preparing for the day. I noticed subtle nods of acknowledgement and respect. It was not the familial warmth I had once known, but it was something tangible, something real. Throughout the day, I held briefings, reviewed project timelines, and listened to concerns. I made adjustments based on merit, not influence. By mid-afternoon, I received a call from Thomas Whitaker. "William, you are moving faster than expected," he said. I smiled. "I am not moving. I am just paying attention now." As I ended the call, I looked across the city from the office window. The sunlight sparkled off the buildings, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the possibility of progress. I realized I was rebuilding not because anyone forced me, not because anyone demanded it, but because I chose to do so. The quiet sense of agency, the ability to make decisions for the work itself, filled me with unexpected satisfaction. As I left the office that evening, I walked past the parking lot where my truck had been waiting all those weeks. I paused, looking at the horizon. There was a sense of momentum now, a subtle but undeniable feeling that, if cultivated carefully, the efforts of today could lead to a stronger, more secure future for both the company and myself. And in that moment, I knew the real transformation was only beginning, with challenges ahead that would finally reveal who was truly capable and who was only acting for appearances. The following months changed me in ways I never expected, not because my circumstances suddenly became easy, but because I stopped measuring my worth through the opinions of other people. Every morning, I arrived at the office before sunrise. The security guard, Frank, would usually be pouring his first cup of coffee. "Morning, Mr. Harrison," he would say. "Morning, Frank." At first, those exchanges seemed ordinary. Later, I realized they represented something important. Respect. Not the kind that comes from a title or a corner office. The kind that comes from consistency. The kind that has to be earned over years. As projects began moving forward again, the atmosphere inside the company slowly changed. Employees who had spent months keeping their heads down started speaking up. Department managers began sharing ideas instead of simply following instructions. For the first time in a long while, conversations focused on solutions instead of rumors. One morning, Carla knocked on my office door. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course." She stepped inside carrying a folder. "I thought you should see this." The folder contained employee feedback from multiple locations. I opened it and read several comments. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for being present again. Thank you for making decisions based on people instead of politics. I looked up. Carla smiled. People notice more than you think. That afternoon, I walked through the main lobby and noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. Mounted beside the reception desk was a polished bronze plaque listing the founders of Harrison Property Services. For years, I had walked past it without paying attention. There, engraved at the top, was my name. William Harrison, founder and chairman. I stood there quietly for several moments. Not because I needed recognition. Quite the opposite. For months, I had almost forgotten what I had spent my life building. Seeing those words reminded me that my story had not started with boardroom politics. It had started with a lawn mower, a pickup truck, and a promise to my family. Later that week, I attended a regional leadership meeting. More than 40 managers filled the conference room. As I entered, conversations paused. Then something unexpected happened. People stood up. Not dramatically. Not because anyone instructed them to. They simply stood. I looked around the room, surprised. Please, I said, motioning toward the chairs. Sit down before somebody thinks I became important overnight. Laughter filled the room. The tension disappeared instantly. During the meeting, ideas flowed freely. Challenges were discussed honestly. Several younger managers impressed me with their creativity. One of them, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, presented an innovative operations plan that could save the company millions over the next few years. When she finished, I smiled. Excellent work. She looked relieved. Really? Absolutely. Keep thinking like that. As the room emptied afterward, Thomas walked beside me. You seem different. I glanced at him. Different how? Calmer. I thought about that for a moment. Maybe I finally stopped trying to control things that are not mine to control. He nodded slowly. That might be the wisest thing you have said all year. That evening, I returned home and opened an old wooden box containing photographs of Margaret. For the first time in a long while, the memories brought comfort instead of pain. I could almost hear her voice. Keep moving forward. Keep your dignity. Keep your heart. As autumn settled over Denver, something else began to settle inside me. Confidence. Not arrogance. Not pride. Confidence built from experience, mistakes, loss, and persistence. And then, one Friday afternoon, as I was preparing to leave the office, Thomas appeared at my door holding a thick folder. His expression told me this was not an ordinary update. He closed the door behind him and placed the folder on my desk. William, he said quietly, the evidence is finally complete. I looked at the folder, then back at him. Suddenly, the months of confusion, silence, and unanswered questions seemed to connect to the present moment. Whatever happened next would not be about assumptions anymore. It would be about facts. The next morning, the air outside was crisp, and Denver lay quiet beneath a thin veil of frost. I arrived at the hospital headquarters early, the building glass reflecting the pale sunlight. I had been summoned for a meeting that felt more like a confrontation waiting to happen. As I walked through the lobby, my reflection on the polished floors reminded me of how much had changed in the past months. Gone was the man waiting for approval from family. Instead, there was focus, awareness, and the determination to reclaim control. Thomas met me at the entrance to the executive suite. His expression was serious, and he held a folder tightly in his hand. William, he said quietly, they are expecting you. Are you ready? I nodded. As ready as I will ever be. The suite door opened, revealing the board of directors along with Brandon and a few key managers. Brandon sat with a calm, confident smile, as if nothing had shifted in the company. Emily stood beside him, her expression unreadable. Good morning, everyone, I said evenly, letting my gaze sweep across the room. The silence was palpable. I felt the weight of the moment, the tension of months compressed into a single breath. Thomas leaned toward me and whispered, "Take your time." I placed the folder on the table and opened it slowly, showing financial statements, project reports, and correspondence that documented months of mismanagement and manipulation. I have been reviewing the company's operations personally. I began, my voice steady. I have also gathered communications that explain why certain decisions were made without proper oversight. Brandon shifted in his seat, maintaining the smile, but I could see his eyes flicker toward Emily and back. One of the managers cleared her throat. "Mr. Harrison, the discrepancies are clear," she said. "The records do not match the presentations we received over the last 6 months." I nodded. "Correct. It is essential that we align the company's direction with actual performance and accountability. Brandon interjected smoothly. I have been following what I believed were directives from leadership. My intention was never to mislead. I held up a hand. Intentions are irrelevant when actions compromise the integrity of the company. That is what this meeting addresses. The room felt charged, each breath deliberate. Emily finally spoke, her voice low. Dad, do you really have all of this evidence? I met her gaze calmly. Yes, Emily. I have the full context. Everything that matters is here. There was a long pause. Board members shifted in their chairs, glancing at each other, aware that the tide had turned. Brandon opened his mouth, then closed it. He understood that the balance of power had shifted subtly but irrevocably. I continued, presenting facts methodically, showing timelines, emails, and reports. It is not about blame, I said, but clarity. We need to restore proper oversight. The room remained tense, the silence thick, until Thomas finally leaned back and said, William, it appears the company is listening. My lips curved into a small smile, but I did not allow it to show too widely. Not yet. I had reached a point where respect and authority were returning through evidence, presence, and calm decisiveness rather than confrontation. The clock ticked deliberately in the background, each second heightening the awareness that a revelation was near. Just as I prepared to reveal the final, critical piece, the door opened slightly, and a junior executive whispered a single line that froze the air. There is one more document you should see before anyone else. I felt the weight of the folder in my hand, and for the first time that morning, a tight anticipation coiled in my chest. The room waited. The moment hung suspended, every eye fixed, and the truth about to be revealed teetered on the edge of disclosure. I took a deep breath and opened the folder slowly, letting each page fall naturally under my fingers. Inside were financial statements, internal memos, and correspondences meticulously arranged to show the chain of decisions made over the past 18 months. I looked up at the board, at Brandon, and then at Emily. Everything here is verifiable, I said quietly, my voice steady. Every project, every allocation, every recommendation is documented. Brandon shifted in his seat. William, I held up a hand. Please allow me to finish. I paused, giving the room a chance to absorb the weight of the documents. This is not about punishment. It is about accountability and clarity. Decisions were being made in your name, in the company's name, without transparency or oversight. Emily's eyes widened slightly, and I could see her processing everything in silence. One of the board members, Linda Foster, spoke first. I had no idea this was happening. I believed the reports we were given were accurate. I nodded. That is exactly the point. When authority is misrepresented, even good intentions cannot prevent misalignment and loss of trust. Brandon's confident mask faltered. I only followed what I thought were directives. I never meant to deceive. I met his gaze evenly. Intentions do not override outcomes. The responsibility for clarity always lies with leadership, and leadership is accountable to the truth. There was a long pause as the room absorbed the calm firmness of my words. Emily finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. Dad, I had no idea how much you had been doing behind the scenes. I never realized, she trailed off. I nodded slightly. I understand why you might not have seen it, but it is all here. I gestured toward the folder. I have been present, not absent. I have guided, corrected, and watched. Everything you assumed was happening in a vacuum has a clear record. Thomas Whitaker added, William, your thoroughness leaves no room for dispute. The facts speak for themselves. I allowed a small pause, letting everyone feel the weight of the truth. Brandon swallowed audibly. I did not think you would have all of this. I inclined my head once. Nor did I wish to reveal it until it became necessary. But the time has come for transparency. Emily's hand moved to rest on Brandon's arm, a quiet gesture of concern. I should have asked more questions, she whispered. I replied gently. Understanding comes from observation, inquiry, and sometimes patience. Now you can see the full picture. Silence filled the room, not tense, but heavy with recognition. One by one, board members acknowledged the clarity restored. Linda spoke again. This changes everything. We can make decisions with full knowledge now. I nodded. Exactly. Knowledge, honesty, and presence are the pillars of leadership. Everything else is secondary. Brandon looked down at his hands. I see that now, he said quietly. I made no comment, letting the truth carry its own weight. Emily took a step closer and looked at me. Dad, you have been far stronger than I ever understood. I offered her a calm smile. It was never about being seen as strong. It was about doing what was right, quietly and consistently. And in that moment, the room seemed to shift. The assumptions, the rumors, the uncertainty, all replaced by recognition. Yet beneath the relief, a subtle tension remained, as if the revelation had cleared the air but left a hidden consequence still waiting to surface. I felt it in the pause, in the way Brandon's eyes flicked toward the documents again, in the stillness of the boardroom. Something was unsettled. Something about this truth had only begun to echo. The source of the final revelation became clear 2 days later. It did not appear from nowhere, and it did not arrive through rumor. It came from a formal internal audit that the board had authorized after reviewing the evidence Thomas and I had assembled. Independent auditors spent weeks reviewing communications, decision logs, authorization trails, and executive correspondence. Their findings confirmed what many people had quietly suspected but could never prove. Several major decisions had been presented to employees and stakeholders as if they reflected broad executive consensus when, in reality, critical information had been withheld from review. The report was delivered directly to the board, and every member received an identical copy. No interpretation, no spin, just facts. The consequences were immediate, not dramatic, but undeniable. Certain responsibilities were reassigned. Oversight procedures were strengthened. Several pending initiatives were paused until they could be properly reviewed. The company began moving forward with greater transparency than it had seen in years. What surprised me most was not the board's reaction. It was my family's. 3 evenings after the report was finalized, Emily called. I stared at the phone for a moment before answering. Hello, Emily. Her voice trembled slightly. Dad, can we meet? I looked out the window toward the fading Colorado sunset. Yes. The next afternoon, we met at a small cafe near Washington Park. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, Emily lowered her eyes. I read the report. I nodded quietly. I assumed you would. She swallowed hard. There were things I did not know. I know. There were things I should have questioned. Her voice cracked slightly. I know that too. Tears filled her eyes. Why did you never tell me everything? I thought carefully before answering. Because I wanted you to reach your own conclusions. If I had spent months defending myself, you would have been choosing between voices. I wanted you to see facts. Emily covered her face briefly. I am sorry. Hearing those words brought no sense of victory. Only sadness. Thank you for saying that, I replied gently. Later that week, Brandon requested a meeting. We sat across from each other in a private conference room. The confident executive I had known for years seemed gone. He looked exhausted. William, he began, I made mistakes. I listened without interrupting. I convinced myself I was protecting the future. Then I convinced myself the ends justified the means. He shook his head. I was wrong. For a few moments, silence filled the room. Then I spoke. Brandon, accountability matters. But so do boundaries. He looked up. What does that mean? I folded my hands calmly. It means forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Forgiveness can begin immediately. Trust must be rebuilt over time. He nodded slowly. I could see he understood. For years, I had confused the two myself. That conversation marked an important change. Not reconciliation. Not yet. Something more realistic. Acknowledgement. During the following weeks, family gatherings remained smaller and quieter than before. Conversations were more careful. Some wounds had started healing. Others remained open. One Sunday afternoon, Tyler stopped by my house unexpectedly. He stood on the porch holding a baseball glove. Grandpa, I smiled. Come in. He hesitated. Would you want to play catch for a little while? My throat tightened. I would like that very much. For nearly an hour we stood in the backyard tossing the ball beneath the autumn sky. Neither of us talked much. We did not need to. Some relationships recover through words. Others recover through presence. Yet even as hope slowly returned, I knew everything was not resolved. Trust takes longer to rebuild than it does to lose. And as I watched the sun disappear beyond the trees that evening, I realized our family was no longer pretending the damage had never happened. We were finally facing it. But whether we could truly move beyond it remained a question none of us could answer yet. The weeks following the boardroom revelations passed with a calm I had not experienced in years. Mornings began with crisp sunlight spilling across my living room, and I found myself drinking coffee quietly on the porch, listening to the faint rustle of leaves and the distant sounds of children playing. Emily and Tyler had begun visiting more frequently, still cautious, still measured, but their presence reminded me that life was slowly weaving its way back to a more balanced rhythm. Brandon, too, had retreated from his previous posturing, working now within clear boundaries and under structured oversight, his confidence tempered by understanding and humility. The company, once a source of tension and betrayal, now moved with steadiness and transparency, departments communicating directly, ideas evaluated fairly, and employees who had previously remained silent finally sharing insights that strengthened our operations. In the evenings, I often walked through Margaret's garden, her favorite lavender swaying gently in the breeze, and it struck me as a symbol of resilience. Roots anchored deeply, yet flexible enough to withstand wind and change. In those moments, I reflected on the lessons of the past year. Trust must be earned, not assumed. Boundaries protect both heart and mind. Value cannot be dictated by others, and independence is the foundation for clarity and peace. I learned that self-respect is not a gift from family or colleagues, but a recognition of one's own worth, cultivated quietly and defended consistently. As I sipped my coffee, I wanted to speak to anyone out there feeling overlooked, dismissed, or betrayed. You are not invisible. Your value is not defined by the opinions or actions of others. Protect your heart, guard your boundaries, and trust your intuition. The universe often rewards those who listen to it patiently. Healing does not require permission, and life can be rebuilt thoughtfully, one deliberate step at a time. Remember to stand firm in your principles, manage your resources wisely, and never let anyone diminish your experience or achievements. Thank you for listening, for being present, and for sharing in this journey, even if only in spirit. You are not alone, and the process of moving from hurt to understanding can be transformative. I am William Harrison, 74 years old, and the core lesson I wish to share with you is that self-awareness and dignity are stronger than any temporary betrayal or misunderstanding. Looking ahead, there are more stories to be told, more lessons hidden in moments both ordinary and profound. In the upcoming videos, you will see how decisions, patience, and quiet integrity shape the lives of those who choose awareness over reaction, and you may find echoes of your own life reflected in these experiences. So stay with us. Explore each chapter carefully, and consider how you might apply these insights to protect your heart, preserve your independence, and embrace the clarity that comes from seeing life fully and deliberately.